Every year, like clockwork, Microsoft nudges up the price it charges PC manufacturers for the right to pre-install Windows. Most years, this passes completely unnoticed. It's a small, single-digit adjustment quietly folded into a supplier agreement, absorbed somewhere inside the sticker price of the next laptop you buy without you ever seeing the line item. This year broke that pattern. Starting in July, Microsoft informed hardware manufacturers that Windows 11 licensing costs were rising by 7 to 10%, roughly double the increase companies like Dell, HP, Asus, Lenovo, and Acer have grown used to absorbing without much fuss. And the timing could hardly be worse. Memory chip prices are spiking, component shortages are dragging on, and PC makers are already raising their own prices independent of anything Microsoft has done. So let's dig into what actually changed, why Microsoft chose this specific moment to push harder than usual, how manufacturers are quietly responding behind closed doors, and why, despite decades of people insisting the world is finally ready to abandon Windows, almost nobody is treating that as a realistic option, even now. Let's start by getting the facts straight, because stories like this tend to snowball into exaggeration fast once they start circulating. The increase traces back to a report from the Taiwanese outlet United Daily News, based on comments from an unnamed executive at a PC brand. According to that reporting, Microsoft raised the price of its Windows 11 OEM licenses, the bulk licensing agreements manufacturers purchased to pre-install Windows at the factory, by an average of 7 to 10%, effective this past July. Put that in context. Microsoft does adjust these prices most years, but historically those bumps have stayed in the low single digits, often just 1 or 2%. Jumping into double-digit territory, even at the lower end of that range, represents a considerably bigger shift than manufacturers are accustomed to. It's worth being precise about exactly who this affects, because confusion about that detail has already started spreading. This increase applies specifically to OEM licenses, the bulk agreements manufacturers sign to pre-install Windows before machines ever reach a store shelf. If you're an individual purchasing a standalone retail copy of Windows 11 directly from Microsoft, nothing has changed for you at all. Windows 11 Home still lists at $139, and Windows 11 Pro remains at $119, identical to what consumers have paid for a while now. This price hike is happening one level up the supply chain between Microsoft and the companies building your computer, not between Microsoft and you. That distinction matters less in practice than it sounds like it should, though, because of how these costs typically flow downstream. When a manufacturer's licensing cost rises, that expense rarely gets quietly absorbed into a shrinking profit margin. It tends to get built directly into the final price tag sitting on a shelf. So even though no individual consumer is being asked to pay Microsoft a higher fee directly, plenty of consumers will likely feel this increase anyway, invisibly folded into the price of their next laptop purchase. One more detail from the reporting deserves mention. This isn't a flat, universal increase applied evenly across the board. Microsoft's OEM pricing already operates on a sliding scale tied to shipment volume and hardware specifications. And according to the reporting, the largest, highest volume manufacturers, companies like Dell, HP, and Asus, are seeing increases closer to the lower end of that range, around 7%, while smaller manufacturers with less negotiating leverage may be facing steeper increases toward the double-digit end. Within any single manufacturer's own lineup, the bump reportedly scales with the machine itself too, with higher spec, pricier configurations, carrying a proportionally larger increase than entry-level models. Looked at in isolation, this might read as a fairly routine, if unusually large, business decision. But the timing is exactly what's turned this into an actual story people are talking about, because it's landing squarely on top of an already brutal year for PC pricing generally. Global memory chip prices have climbed sharply throughout 2026, driven substantially by the same AI infrastructure boom reshaping the broader tech industry. Massive data center construction is consuming enormous volumes of global RAM and storage chip supply, leaving less available at higher cost for everyday laptops and desktops. Component shortages have compounded that pressure further, straining supply chains that were already fragile to begin with. The upshot is that PC prices were already climbing throughout this year, entirely independent of anything Microsoft did. Both Asus and Acer have signaled additional price increases of roughly 5% in the coming months. Asus specifically has seen cumulative pricing climb by something close to 30% since the final quarter of last year alone, a genuinely striking figure for an industry that has traditionally competed fiercely over shaving pennies off manufacturing costs. The broader market is already showing real strain from this. Global PC shipments actually fell by roughly 4.9% year over year in this year's second quarter, with major players including Lenovo, HP, and Dell all posting declines. Notably, Apple stood out as essentially the only major vendor to grow during that same period, helped by demand for its lower-cost MacBook lineup. A detail that hasn't gone unnoticed by anyone inside the Windows PC ecosystem watching a direct competitor gain ground while their own market shrinks around them. So, when Microsoft's licensing increase arrived in the middle of all of that, rising memory costs, shrinking shipment volumes, manufacturers already raising prices just to keep pace with their own component bills, it landed less like a routine annual adjustment and more like an additional wound on top of an already bruised industry. PC makers weren't simply facing a somewhat bigger bill from Microsoft. They were facing that bill on top of every other cost, already spiraling around them, with essentially no remaining room to just quietly absorb the difference. There's also a theory circulating in tech press circles about why Microsoft chose this particular year to push harder than its usual pattern, and it centers on the company's enormous ongoing investment in artificial intelligence. Microsoft, like most of its major competitors, has poured extraordinary sums into AI infrastructure and data centers over the past several years, and that spending hasn't yet translated into anything close to matching profitability. It remains a bet on future returns rather than a business currently paying for itself. Some analysts and commentators have suggested that squeezing additional revenue from a mature, dependable cash source like Windows OEM licensing is a fairly predictable move for a company trying to offset losses elsewhere on its balance sheet, even though Microsoft hasn't publicly framed the increase in those terms. It helps, too, to understand just how unusual Windows' position has become within Microsoft's overall business. A decade ago, Windows licensing sat as one of the company's clear headline revenue drivers, discussed openly on earnings calls, as a pillar of the entire business. Today, Microsoft's public financial reporting leans far more heavily on cloud computing through Azure, on productivity subscriptions through Microsoft 365, and increasingly on AI services layered across both of those. Windows itself has quietly shifted from Spotlight product to dependable background utility. Still enormous in absolute revenue, given how many hundreds of millions of machines run it, but no longer the centerpiece of the company's growth narrative. That shift, arguably, makes Windows an easier target for a quiet price increase. It's far less likely to move a stock price or trigger analyst scrutiny than an adjustment to cloud or subscription pricing would, even though the raw dollar figures involved, spread across the entire global PC market, are anything but trivial. So what does actually fighting back look like in an industry where, realistically, nobody can simply walk away from Microsoft's operating system? It isn't open rebellion. It's considerably quieter and more limited than that phrase suggests, but it's real and worth understanding what genuine options manufacturers actually have available to them. The most immediate, most visible response is simply passing the added cost along. That's already happening. Price increases showing up on new laptop and desktop listings this quarter reflect not just rising memory and component costs, but the additional Windows licensing expense baked in alongside them. For the average shopper, that shows up as an invisible line item. You'll never see Microsoft licensing surcharge printed anywhere on a price tag, but the practical effect is identical to if you did. Behind the scenes, there's a second, more interesting layer to this story. Manufacturers like Framework, a smaller repair-focused laptop maker that's built its entire brand identity around transparency and consumer choice, have already been publicly flagging rising Windows licensing costs as one of several pressures pushing their own prices upward, well before this latest increase made headlines. That kind of public acknowledgement from a manufacturer is relatively rare. Most large, mainstream OEMs tend to fold these costs quietly into pricing, rather than calling out Microsoft by name directly, likely because Microsoft remains an enormously powerful partner they need to maintain good standing with. And that gets at the core tension running through this entire story. PC manufacturers are, in a very real sense, stuck. Windows isn't simply one operating system option among several equally viable choices for a mainstream computer maker. It's the default, the thing the overwhelming majority of consumers expect their laptop to run the instant they open the box. Walking away from that relationship, or even meaningfully pushing back against it in public, carries genuine risk to a manufacturer's core business. Every single time a story like this breaks, the same suggestion floods comment sections almost immediately. Just switch to Linux. It's free, it's open source, and it eliminates this entire licensing cost overnight. On paper, that logic is completely sound. So why doesn't it happen at any meaningful scale? This isn't a new idea, and it's not one manufacturers haven't already tried. Back in the mid-2000s, more than 100,000 customers directly petitioned Dell, specifically asking the company to offer machines with Linux pre-installed instead of Windows. Dell listened and launched a small consumer line built around exactly that demand. It still exists today in some form, aimed mostly at developers and enthusiasts, But it never grew beyond a niche offering, and it never came close to threatening Windows' position as the default choice for mainstream shoppers. That history matters, because this current moment is essentially running the same experiment again in real time, just with higher stakes attached. The barriers that kept Linux from breaking through back then remain largely in place today, and they're structural, not the product of some secret conspiracy to keep buyers locked into Windows. Start with software compatibility. The overwhelming majority of consumer software, major creative tools, specialized business applications, the enormous back catalog of PC gaming, is built and tested for Windows first, and frequently exclusively. Compatibility layers and workarounds have genuinely improved over the years, particularly for gaming specifically. But for an average shopper who simply wants their laptop to reliably run whatever they already use without extra troubleshooting, Windows remains the path of least resistance. Then there's the support and returns problem, which matters more to manufacturers than it might appear from the outside. Big box retailers and mainstream PC makers are built around a customer base that generally doesn't want to troubleshoot an unfamiliar operating system on their own. A Linux laptop. A customer doesn't know how to use, generates more support calls, more returns, and more one-star reviews than a Windows machine running an interface people already recognize from work, school, or their last several computers. For a company already operating on thin PC hardware margins, that support burden represents a real cost, even if it never appears on a licensing invoice. And then there's simple leverage. Historically, Microsoft's relationship with PC manufacturers has given the company enormous influence over how machines get built and sold, dating back to antitrust scrutiny in the late 1990s and 2000s over exclusivity arrangements tied to Windows licensing. Today's version of that dynamic operates through pricing tiers and volume. Discounts rather than explicit contractual exclusivity clauses, but the underlying incentive remains similar. Manufacturers that lean heavily on Windows and avoid publicly rocking the boat tend to receive better terms than those diversifying aggressively into alternative operating systems. Where you actually do see meaningful momentum away from Windows right now isn't in the mainstream consumer market at all. It's happening in the public sector. Various government agencies and municipalities across different countries have been piloting or fully migrating to Linux-based systems in recent years, largely driven by cost savings at scale and a genuine desire for more control over their own technology infrastructure, independent of a single vendor's pricing decisions. But large government procurement decisions operate on entirely different incentives and timelines than a shopper walking into a big box electronics store this weekend looking for a laptop. And that gap explains much of why this pressure hasn't spilled over into visible consumer market movement yet. So a 10% OEM licensing increase, however uncomfortable for manufacturers absorbing it, sits well below the threshold where switching operating systems starts to look like the cheaper option once you account for lost sales, higher support costs, and compatibility complaints. It's an unwelcome cost bump, not an existential crisis, at least not yet, and not at this size. It's also worth noting that Linux's overall profile has genuinely improved in recent years in ways that make this conversation less purely theoretical than it might have been a decade ago. Valve's Steam Deck, running a Linux-based operating system, has sold in the millions and demonstrated that a mainstream consumer device can run Linux successfully for gaming specifically, thanks to major improvements in compatibility layers, letting a large share of the Windows game library run acceptably well without modification. Some boutique and enthusiast-focused PC makers have started offering Linux distributions as a pre-installed option, marketed specifically toward buyers who want to avoid Windows entirely. But even accounting for that genuine progress, none of it has translated into pressure on Dell, HP, Lenovo, or Asus to offer Linux as a mainstream checkout option alongside Windows for an ordinary shopper buying a general-purpose laptop. The momentum is real, but it stays concentrated in specific niches: gaming handhelds, developer machines, enthusiast builds, rather than spreading into the mass market where these licensing increases are actually being felt. To really appreciate why this current friction feels different from past grumbling, it helps to understand just how long and how genuinely complicated Microsoft's relationship with PC manufacturers actually is. Windows has served as the default operating system pre-installed on the overwhelming majority of consumer PCs for roughly 3.5 decades now, a run of market dominance. Very few products in any industry can match. For most of that history, the relationship between Microsoft and companies like Dell, HP, Compaq, and later Lenovo and Asus has been symbiotic, almost out of necessity. Microsoft needed hardware partners to actually get Windows into people's homes and offices, and those hardware partners needed an operating system reliable and familiar enough that customers wouldn't hesitate before buying. That relationship hasn't always been friction-free. Back in the late 1990s and early 2000s, Microsoft's licensing practices with OEMs became the subject of a major antitrust case in the United States, centered partly on allegations that Microsoft used its Windows licensing leverage to discourage manufacturers from offering competing software, including early web browsers and buys, in some cases, alternative operating systems. That case reshaped some of Microsoft's contractual practices going forward, but it didn't fundamentally alter the underlying economic reality. Windows remained close to indispensable for any manufacturer hoping to sell into the mainstream consumer market. In the years since, Microsoft has occasionally used pricing flexibility as a competitive tool rather than a pure profit lever, famously offering steep discounts or even free Windows licenses for low-cost devices like early netbooks in the late 2000s, specifically to keep budget-friendly Linux-based machines from gaining a real foothold in that segment of the market. That history serves as a useful reminder that Windows pricing has never been purely about simple cost plus economics. It's always also functioned as a strategic tool for maintaining market position, adjusted up or down depending on whatever threat Microsoft happened to be managing at the time. Seen through that lens, this year's unusually large increase raises an interesting question worth sitting with. It's happening at a moment when Windows arguably faces less genuine competitive pressure from cheap alternative operating systems than it did during the netbook era, which may be exactly why Microsoft feels comfortable pushing prices upward now rather than defensively downward the way it did back then. There's another thread running through the public reaction to this story worth acknowledging honestly because it comes up constantly across comment sections on every article covering this topic. Frustration with rising Windows costs pushing some users toward unauthorized copies or unofficial activation workarounds instead of paying for a license at all. It's a genuine sentiment, and it reflects real frustration with a company plenty of users already feel nickel and dimes them through advertising embedded in the Start menu, a Copilot AI assistant that's been difficult to fully disable, and a content feed critics describe as functioning more like a traffic funnel toward Microsoft's other properties than a genuinely useful feature. Layer a licensing price hike on top of an operating system a lot of people already feel resentful toward, and it's unsurprising that resentment shows up loudly in public reaction. But it's worth separating public venting from actual large-scale market behavior. Piracy has existed around every version of Windows for decades, largely independent of specific pricing changes, and this particular increase, again, one that doesn't even touch retail consumer pricing directly, is unlikely to meaningfully shift that underlying pattern on its own. It reads more as a symptom of accumulated frustration with the platform generally than a direct proportional response to this specific price change. It's easy, in a video like this one, to frame Microsoft purely as the villain squeezing an already strained industry for extra revenue. There's a real case for consumer and manufacturer frustration here. But it's worth laying out Microsoft's likely reasoning too, because a fuller picture serves you better than a one-sided one. Interestingly, this pricing increase arrives during a stretch where Microsoft has actually been putting real effort into improving Windows 11 itself. Over the course of this year, the company has worked on trimming back some of the operating system's most criticized annoyances, scaling back Copilot's more aggressive presence, reducing surprise background updates, and adding more customization options for the taskbar and Start menu, alongside general performance improvements. Some industry commentators have floated the idea that Microsoft may be framing this licensing increase, at least internally, as funding for that ongoing product investment, though it's worth noting Microsoft hasn't publicly connected the two in any official statement. And plenty of critics argue the improvements made so far still fall well short, given how much advertising and promotional content remains baked into a default Windows 11 installation. There's also a simpler, more mundane possibility worth taking seriously rather than dismissing outright. This could simply be ordinary corporate cost management, dressed up in a lot of dramatic headlines. Component costs are rising industry-wide. Currency fluctuations affect international licensing agreements. Microsoft, like every other major technology company, periodically reassesses its enterprise and partner pricing structures independent of any single dramatic motive. A 7 to 10% increase, however unwelcome for the manufacturers absorbing it, isn't actually unprecedented in the broader history of enterprise software licensing generally. It's simply unusually large relative to Microsoft's own recent track record with these specific fees. What we genuinely don't have, and what's worth being upfront about, is any official public statement from Microsoft directly addressing or confirming the specific 7 to 10% figure being reported. Everything currently circulating traces back to a single Taiwanese industry report, citing an unnamed PC brand executive, subsequently picked up and repeated across a wide range of tech outlets. That doesn't mean the reporting is wrong. Multiple independent outlets have since corroborated the core claim through their own industry sources, But it does mean we're working from secondhand industry chatter rather than a formal Microsoft announcement. And the exact dollar figures involved remain somewhat fuzzy, since Microsoft negotiates OEM pricing individually with each manufacturer rather than publishing a single universal rate for everyone. So, practically speaking, if you're in the market for a new Windows laptop or desktop sometime soon, what should you actually expect? First, brace for prices already trending upward and understand that this licensing increase is really just one ingredient in a much larger pricing story this year, not the sole driver of it. Memory and component shortages are doing most of the heavy lifting behind rising PC prices in 2026. This Windows licensing bump adds to that pressure, but isn't single-handedly responsible for whatever sticker shock you might notice on a new machine. Second, expect this increase to land harder on certain segments of the market than others. Given that the licensing bump appears to scale with machine specifications, premium, high-end configurations are likely seeing a proportionally bigger increase than entry-level budget machines. If you're shopping at the lower end of the market, you may feel this particular increase less directly than someone eyeing a high-spec gaming laptop or workstation. Third, if you're comfortable building or configuring your own machine, it's worth knowing that individual retail Windows 11 licenses remain entirely unaffected by this specific increase, still sitting at $139 for home and $199 for Pro. Buying a bare bones? No. Operating system machine or building your own desktop and adding Windows separately doesn't currently carry this particular OEM markup, though that path obviously comes with its own trade-offs in convenience and setup time that not every buyer wants to take on. And fourth, for the more adventurous or budget-conscious shopper, this might be a reasonable moment to at least seriously consider Linux for a secondary machine, an older laptop getting a second life, or a use case that doesn't demand specific Windows, only software, even if it's genuinely not realistic for most people to make it their primary daily driver overnight. The gap between Linux and Windows for general browsing, office work, and media consumption has narrowed considerably in recent years, even if it hasn't closed entirely for gaming and specialized software. Step back far enough, and this story isn't really about a 7 to 10% figure buried in a supplier contract. It's a small, concrete example of something far larger, playing out across the entire tech industry in 2026. Enormous companies pouring almost unimaginable sums into artificial intelligence infrastructure without a clear, immediate path toward matching profitability, and then quietly looking for ways to recoup some of that spending from every other corner of their existing business. Windows, for all its faults and all its critics, remains one of Microsoft's most dependable, predictable sources of revenue. A mature product installed on hundreds of millions of machines worldwide, generating steady income year after year with relatively little additional investment required to sustain that flow. Squeezing a bit more out of that reliable pipeline, even at the cost of some frustration among manufacturers and consumers, is a fairly logical move for a company trying to balance its books while its bigger, riskier bets slowly play out over time. For PC manufacturers caught in the middle, the honest reality is that there isn't really a dramatic act of rebellion coming. What fighting back actually looks like in practice is manufacturers absorbing what costs they can, passing along what they can't, quietly, lobbying for better terms behind closed doors, and continuing to explore alternative operating systems at the margins without ever seriously threatening Microsoft's grip on the mainstream consumer market. It's less a battle than an ongoing negotiation, playing out mostly in boardrooms and supplier contracts most of us will never actually see. Whether that quiet negotiation eventually tips into something more dramatic, a genuine mainstream push toward Linux, a formal regulatory challenge, or simply another year of rising prices everyone grumbles about and then buys anyway, remains a genuinely open question right now. But for the moment, the story here isn't Windows getting dethroned, it's the cost of staying on top. Quietly climbing, one supplier invoice at a time, for a product a huge share of the world still can't easily walk away from. If you're shopping for a new machine anytime soon, the smartest move is simply going in with your eyes open. Compare prices across brands. Factor in that premium configurations are likely carrying a proportionally bigger, hidden increase than budget models, and don't assume last year's pricing still applies. Because right now, quietly, it doesn't.